Okay, hi, so I'm Matt Notowidigdo. I'm an associate professor of economics at Northwestern University. And on behalf of my co-authors, Amy Finkelstein at MIT and Erzo Luttmer at Dartmouth, I wanted to say that we are honored to receive the Hicks Tinbergen Award for our paper, What Good is Wealth Without Health? The Effect of Health on the Marginal Utility of Consumption. So we started working on this paper back in the summer of 2008 when I was a graduate student at MIT and Amy was my advisor. And after many revisions and resubmissions, the paper was eventually published by the Journal of the European Economic Association in January of 2013. So in this short video, I want to do a couple things. I first want to give a brief motivation of our paper. And then next, I'm going to summarize the empirical approach and the results. And then finally, I wanted to conclude with some speculative thoughts about the use of happiness data in economics, and more broadly, about the use of subjective data on people's beliefs, their attitudes, their preferences. So I'll conclude with that at the end. There's a large literature in health economics studying the demand for health-related insurance products, such as disability insurance, life insurance, annuities, and the motivation for our paper starts with the observation that existing empirical estimates typically assume that the individual utility function, the shape of that function specifically, does not vary with an individual's health. That is, it's health state independent. Now, a long line of work going back to Zeckhauser and Ken Arrow in the 1970s notes that if the individual's utility function is actually health state dependent, then that can have a broad range of implications for questions like the demand for insurance or the extent to which individuals would like to save for retirement. And so in our paper, what we try to do is estimate the extent to which an individual's utility function is health state dependent. And we have some figures at the beginning of the paper to illustrate what we're talking about here. So in the first figure, there's a solid line indicating the individual's utility function when that individual is in good health, and there's a dashed line indicating the individual's utility function when he or she is in poor health. And you see that in this figure, the dashed line is flatter, and we call that negative health state dependence. In the second figure, we show that, of course, this could go in the other direction. The individual utility function could get steeper as health deteriorates, and we call that positive health state dependence. So the reason why this matters is that the extent of health state dependence affects the demand for insurance. It can also affect the amount that individuals wish to save for retirement. And so the title of our paper, What Good is Wealth Without Health, is meant to suggest that the additional value of additional income or wealth could depend on whether the individual is currently experiencing good health or not. The extent to which health and wealth are complementary, then that would imply negative health state dependence, as I've described in the figures before. So ultimately, whether individuals on average have negative health state dependence or positive health state dependence is an empirical question. And so we think the main contribution of our paper is providing some new empirical estimates of the extent to which individuals exhibit health state dependence. And to do that, we use a proxy for utility and attempt to directly estimate state dependence using that proxy. With that proxy, the empirical approach is actually very straightforward. We observe individuals over time, we observe them as their health deteriorates, and then we observe using the utility proxy the extent to which their utility falls. And by comparing how much utility falls as health deteriorates across individuals that have different levels of consumption, we can directly estimate health state dependence. And the key, of course, is the utility proxy. And so in our paper, what we use is a measure of subjective well-being, specifically the answer to the question, during the past week, would you say that much of the time you were happy? That is a measure of subjective well-being that's been used a lot in the happiness literature, and we use it here to estimate the extent of health state dependence. The data we use comes from the Health and Retirement Survey, which is a large household panel data set of elderly and near elderly adults in the United States. The survey data set contains a lot of rich information about income, about health, and it also contains several subjective well-being questions which we use in our analysis. So across a range of specifications, we find moderate negative health state dependence. That is, the shape of the utility function flattens out as health deteriorates, as shown in the figures earlier. We can summarize this in figure 2, which shows that for relatively low-income individuals, when they experience a decline in their health, their happiness declines, but it appears to decline by a fairly small and statistically insignificant amount. By contrast, when we look at individuals with relatively high incomes, we see that when they experience onset of chronic illness, for example, their happiness declines by a much larger amount, and an amount by which it's strongly statistically significant according to our estimates. I think it's also interesting to note that both for individuals with good health, we see that happiness rises with income, and for individuals with poor health, we see that their happiness also increases with income, although it increases to a lesser extent. And that's consistent with the negative state dependence that we find in our main results. So how do these estimates matter? At the end of the paper, we go through several calibrations simulating some simple economic models to see how the extent of negative health state dependence that we estimate can affect some interesting economic questions, such as the demand for insurance or the amount that individuals wish to save for retirement. And what we find is, given the amount of negative health state dependence we estimate, it looks as if individuals would save significantly less for retirement than they would in a world in which their individual utility function shifted around in parallel and did not change its shape. Well, I think that's interesting, and I'm speaking for myself here, not for my other co-authors, because there's a lot of explanations that have been proposed to explain why it appears that Americans are not saving enough for retirement. One of those explanations comes from Mark Aguiar and Eric Hurst, who emphasize the distinction between consumption and expenditure. Another class of explanations comes from researchers like Dick Thaler, who emphasize behavioral economic explanations related to time inconsistency or myopia. And what I think is interesting is that negative health state dependence is potentially another explanation to think about when deciding the extent to which Americans are not, in fact, saving optimally for retirement. I think the most controversial part of this paper is the use of happiness data as a proxy for individual utility. Economists, on average, I think, are rightly skeptical about the use of happiness data or subjective well-being measures more broadly as being suitable proxies for utility. And subsequent work by Dan Benjamin and co-authors, I think, has done a nice job carefully highlighting the limitations of subjective well-being data, but at the same time also highlighting the situations or the context when subjective well-being data looks to be fairly consistent with the preferences that are revealed by people when they make active choices. That said, I think the use of happiness data is part of a trend in economics towards actually talking to the subjects that we are studying. Or in preparing this video, Erzo told me that he thinks this is a main advantage that economists have over chemists or physicists, say. We can actually talk to the subjects who we are trying to understand. And I think that there's been some really interesting and innovative work in the last several years that has been consistent with this. So one example is the recent work by Nathan Hendren, which uses subjective probability elicitations as a measure of agents' beliefs, and he uses these subjective probability measures to study the role of private information in insurance markets. Another example is the recent work of Kerwin Charles and John Gurian studying racial prejudice and equilibrium wages. They construct a proxy for racial prejudice based on elicited responses from survey questions about race-related topics such as racial segregation or interracial marriage. And a last example, which is close to some of my own recent research, is work by Alan Kruger and Andreas Mueller. And what they do is they survey unemployed workers repeatedly over the duration of their unemployment spell, and they elicit reservation wages. And their goal is to study how reservation wages evolve over the unemployment spell, and also to look at the extent to which reservation wages are affected by the generosity of unemployment insurance benefits, which are both very classic questions in labor economics. And I think in all of these cases, there are real measurement concerns with these proxy variables, but I think the authors do an admirable job addressing them. And I think as a result, they make some important progress on some key economic questions. So I'd like to think that our paper is part of a trend towards the careful use of subjective data in all fields of economics. So to conclude, I wanted to thank the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern for helping put this video together. And lastly, I wanted to say thanks again on behalf of Amy, Erzo, and myself, saying thanks to the European Economic Association for this very special award.